Hello and welcome to the World Wanderers podcast, a proud part of the Wander Barn Podcast Network.
I'm Ryan.
I'm Amanda.
And we're your hosts.
We're a traveling couple and digital nomads taking you on our adventures as we explore locations, destinations, and careers.
Enjoy the show.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the World Wanderers podcast. We are very excited for today's episode of the show. And as always, thank you so much for listening to the podcast. We really appreciate that you choose to listen to our podcast of all the podcasts that are out there. And we hope that you enjoy this episode. This week on the podcast, we are joined by Stephen Ladd. Stephen is a city planner, a voyager, and a memoirist. He is the author of 3 Years in a 12-Foot Boat, in which he rowed and sailed to South America and back in a tiny boat of his own design, as well as the 5-Year Voyage, exploring Latin American coasts and rivers. In this episode of the podcast, Stephen shares what inspired him to travel by boat, what it was like traveling in South America for 5 years by boat with his wife, including what it was like to have a baby along the way. He shares how he planned this trip, highlights from his trips, as well as challenges of the lifestyle of living on a boat and navigating coasts and rivers and so much more. So this is a super fun episode. Stephen has a lot of great stories and insights to share, so we hope that you really enjoy that. Before we get into it, I just wanted to give a quick little shout out to everyone who is joining us on Patreon for the World Wanderers Insider. If you are somebody who is working remotely and considering traveling, or maybe somebody who's already doing digital nomad life and wants to learn how to be more efficient, productive, how to balance work and travel a little bit better, and get tips and insights from us as well as guests that we've had on the show, we would love to have you join us. You can head on over to patreon.com/The World Wanderers. And of course, we would love to see you there. All right, let's get into the episode. Without further ado, here is Stephen. Welcome to the show today, Stephen. We're really excited to have you here with us.
Nice to be here.
Where are you joining us from?
Bremerton, Washington is just a ferry ride away from Seattle.
Oh, amazing. So pretty close to, we're from Canada, from Western Canada and Alberta, and Ryan grew up in BC. So pretty close to where we're from.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And so we're really excited to dive into, your whole story. You've just had amazing adventures over the last couple of years. And I think maybe let's like back up. Like, where did you first kind of get your inspiration to start traveling from?
Well, I guess from my parents, it was mostly that as a family living in, the western part of North America, where there's lots of camping and boating opportunities. We just did a lot of that. And then later on in their lives, my mom and dad traveled a lot, but really I started traveling before they did. And so the sense of adventure that my parents instilled in me and, hiking and camping and boating, I carried forward into longer distance hiking, camping, boating, of a traveling format. I also traveled by motorcycle and bus and hitchhiking a lot too. In my early years, as I graduated from high school, in fact, even before I graduated from high school, I went and traveled in Europe. And then again, when I graduated from high school. And so that just a sense of adventure just came kind of natural to me.
Yeah, that's amazing. And then where did sailing come into the picture? Like, had you been sailing when you were younger, or, why did you decide hey, sailing would be a cool way to travel the world?
Yeah, sailing was just my own idea. Again, with my parents and my childhood, boating was somewhat always around. Being on the Puget Sound, there's boats, and my parents and our family sometimes boated with other families, but we didn't have our own boat. But when it came time to me kind of delving more deeply into adventures, I realized the advantages of a small boat to be able. It's like if you're hiking, all that stuff's on your back. It's kind of heavy, right? And so if you have a little boat, well, then you don't have to carry it on your back, and you can move around. You can sleep on your boat. And so you don't have to put your tent up every night. If you're thinking it from the scale of hiking and what's a next step, then a very small boat is a pretty logical next step. In terms of the sailing aspect, well, that's just common sense that you don't want to have to be reliant on a gas motor and have the noise of it all the time.
Yeah. And then, so how do you go from kind of the early interest in it to, I want to spend years entirely traveling, exploring the world by boat?
Yeah. Well, I do, this is so long ago now, but I do have pretty clear memories of certain aspects of it. I remember that that year before I graduated from high school, I traveled in Europe for 6 weeks and thought, wow, this is really great, And so and when I graduate, I'm going to really do it up. And by the way, I think it's a good thing for kids that are leaving the nest to really leave the nest. At least that's what I did. And so I traveled for a year after graduate from high school. And I had read a book by James A. Michener called Caravans that talked about Afghanistan. His books always glamorize the true romantic adventure stories that took place in these different parts of the world that he focuses on, one being Afghanistan. The book Caravans just made me say, that's where I want to go. I want to go to Afghanistan. And so I planned my adventure and I went. I bought a motorcycle in Europe, but realized that hitchhiking would be better. So I spent most of that trip hitchhiking, not on my motorcycle.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so what did you do with the motorcycle if you were hitchhiking?
Well, so my best friend and I, we flew to Western Europe, and we both got really, for kids that are just barely turned 18 years old, this is pretty heady stuff. He got a Triumph Bonneville 650 and I got a BMW 750. And we toured around Western Europe a little bit with that, just kind of long enough to realize that that's cool and everything, but it isn't really the sense of freedom that at least I wanted, and he agreed with me. I wanted something footloose and fancy free. This big machine, we had no mechanical skills. How could we ever hope to go across Asia or across the Sahara Desert on these big, complicated, heavy motorcycles? They're going to break down or we're going to get in an accident or something. So I think it was a good choice we just kind of warehoused them at a friend's house and went hitchhiking instead.
Yeah, I love hearing that story. I feel like those are just the types of adventures that I feel like you just have to do while you're young, because you've just got this sort of like carefree type of attitude and that type of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so we went and we did that, and we actually split up on the way. That is my friend and I. It was like, it was a coming of age thing. It's when you're that age, you call it a walkabout or something, and you have to eject yourself out the escape hatch, and be on your own and see what happens. And it involved us having to be separate because we had to be individuals. You can't fully explore who you are unless it's just you. If you're bringing all your past with you, then how you expect to emphasize your own individual personality. So we split up, which was traumatic. And then, so at least in my part of the story is I got quite far. I got to the border with India, but then due to circumstances, a war between India and Pakistan, mainly, I came back to Europe. And by that time I thought, well, I think I'm mature enough to continue this time on my motorcycle. So I came back to Holland where my motorcycle was, and I went on, in a way, another adventure because I went from there down into Africa. And so anyway, that ended up with me being in prison in Morocco for a month. So again, a traumatic experience, but no lasting harm done.
Yeah, that's good to hear. And so for you, this is, kind of a big trip that you took. Like, was travel just kind of something you were doing continuously? Did you take a pause to, work full time, or what was life kind of looking like as you gear up towards, these kind of bigger sailing trips?
Yeah. Well, as travelers yourself, you probably know what wanderlust means. It's a itching desire, almost a need to travel, to experience these things. And for me, it has two sort of amplitudes or ways of being satisfied. It can be satisfied on the more current day by day basis of stuff you do during your everyday life, and then there's the longer frequency but bigger events that you can do. So I did a lot of this, like all during my college years, for example, because I came back from those earlier travels. I went to college, and every weekend, more or less, I would get out of my last class on Friday, and I would ride my bicycle to the freeway on-ramp. This was in Bellingham, Washington. And I chained my bicycle to a lamppost, and then I stuck out my thumb and I went hitchhiking. Or I went from there to a ski area or whatever, because I'd had this wanderlust still, but it had to coexist. It had to coexist with my going to college. There was never any thought that I would not go to college or continue in a career. So after the college, I went into a career, but I kept these hiking and skiing and bicycling and motorcycling and skin diving types of things going on. But then that was kind of like feeding without a totally satisfactory way. The wanderlust that's there is not totally satisfied by that. It's keeping it at bay, but it's not. But there's still something growing. And so after another 18 years, my first travel was at the age of 18. Well, when I was 36, I went on the voyage that's written about in 3 years in a 12-foot boat. So that was a 3-year voyage in that small boat. And then another 18 years went by, and I went on the voyage with my now wife that was written about in the 5-year voyage. So these have been every 18 years that I've gone on these 3 major trips that I've been on.
Yeah. I think we can definitely feel that as well. For us, it's been a number of years since we have lots of like smaller adventures, of course, but that last hey, we're quitting everything, we're leaving everything behind type adventure. And I think we have a craving for it sometime soon. But for you, I'd love to talk about that first trip briefly, and then really dive into the second 5-year voyage. But yeah, so kind of walk us through, what is it? A 12-foot boat? I think most people realize that's a very small boat. But kind of how do you get the idea? How do you get prepared for it? And what did that trip look like in terms of the route you were going to take and what the day-to-day was going to be?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In the late 80s, I decided it was time for me to build my own sailboat and really design my own sailboat. So I started designing a boat without much background in that. I just kind of learned as I went about the basics of how to do that. And it had a funny sequence. I designed a boat to a large extent. The concept of it was fairly gelled. And then due to a personal circumstance of breaking up with a girlfriend, I changed the scale of the drawings so that instead of being a 30-foot sailboat, it would only be 12 feet long. And that was because, if it's just me, being really small, that would be really handy. I could move it on the back of a pickup truck, and I can pull it up on the beach by myself. It's, okay, there's the scale of things. We talked about backpacking. Well, there's another scale that's just slightly larger where you've got a canoe or a sea kayak there. But as long as that canoe or sea kayak can be dragged up on the beach at night or portaged, you've got a fairly versatile, minimalistic approach here. And so my 12-foot boat was like that. It was light enough to drag it around and portage it by myself. So that's how that concept of a boat came through its completion and got built, was this 12-foot boat that weighed 250 pounds. Well, about 250, maybe a little bit less than that, but then of course there's all your gear. So with the gear, it's more than 250 pounds, your water and everything. And then that boat told me, what its capabilities were, where I could go with it. And in a small boat, any boat probably, but especially a small boat, you're in a watery, damp environment. You're around spray and rain, so it's uncomfortable to be in cold climates, and better to go south. And so it made sense to me to go down a river system that goes south, which is the Missouri, Mississippi, and then see what happens beyond that. And I did make it to South America and back.
Wow, that's incredible. It's so cool to hear that you did that big journey and just dove into it and whatnot. And so maybe we can fast forward to kind of that bigger trip and dive into a little bit more about that. So you said, so you were on the boat for 3 years and then you were traveling solo during your first trip, correct?
That's right.
And then, so you met your now wife that second trip, and did it take some convincing to get her interested in like, hey, let's get another boat, let's leave everything behind, let's go on this big trip?
Well, before we met, or I guess when we were maybe aware of each other, she read my book, and that is the 3 years on a 12-foot boat. And so she knew what I was about, more or less. And then we started seeing each other, just going on some weekend hikes together and so forth is all we ever did. And then when we became more like a couple, she said, I'm interested in doing an adventure like you did, as written about in that book. And in fact, this is an ultimatum. I'm going on such an adventure, and you can either come with me or stay here. So I had to go with her, and so it was really her idea.
Amazing.
But her idea to do it, that is her idea to do it. But leaving it, when I joined in, she left it more up to me because of my greater experience to decide the details of like boats and stuff like that.
Yeah. And so why did you guys decide on South America for that trip?
Well, here again, the concept of it morphed and came into its final state with some evolution through time. The first idea was to go down to more limited, it was to go down to the coast of the Caribbean coasts of the Yucatan and Belize, and snorkel. It's mainly oriented towards snorkeling and getting out to the reefs, because there are these coral reefs there. There's coral reefs more or less right off the shore, like a half mile to a mile away from the shoreline, at least of these barrier islands. But then there are these bigger atolls, coral atolls, that are like 20 miles out or 40 miles out. And these are quite stupendous places. And so we wanted to get to those places, and we found a boat that needed a lot of modification, and like a year and a half worth of modifications. It was suitable for this kind of accessing us to these places. And then that was really good for that. It was good for the Caribbean. Is a rough sea. It's a good sea for sailing. It's got it's warm. The wind is strong and steady. And so that's really, really a good combination. You can sail that sea really well, but it's rough. You don't want to mess around with it. And these shores along the Caribbean coast of the Yucatan and Belize, these are lee shores. The wind is blowing you onto shore, which is always more dangerous. And so the boat being so good for that, we just realized, these little atolls and these little reefs in this little area here, that's not at all capturing the potential of this boat. This boat can really take us places. And so we just enjoyed it, and we just kept going. We, as you know from the book, we went down the whole length of Central America on the Caribbean side. And then from Panama, we followed the curvature of the Caribbean Sea. So we were now going east, and got to Venezuela, and then a major changeover occurred. From my earlier travel, 3 years in a 12-foot boat, I had spent part of that time on the rivers of South America and transporting by car or pickup truck my boat to get over the Andes Mountains. So I knew that this was possible. And so now with Ginny and our boat, which was a little bigger, instead of 12 feet, it's 21 feet. Still a light boat. It's a rowboat and a sailboat. And then later on, we also got a very small outboard motor, but light enough, small enough to transport it economically. Find somebody with a boat trailer or a kind of a big pickup truck or some kind of vehicle that could transport us. And we got into the rivers of South America, and then followed 2 or 3 years of realizing that the South American continent is really well endowed with rivers. There are these big rivers. It has the biggest rivers in the world by far, and they're not without great difficulty. You can do these portages to set you up for the next river. Go all the way up one, do a portage, and then go all the way down the next. And there may be a dam in the way, or a rapid, or a waterfall. But where there are such things, there's ways to portage around it. And so we explored, it's actually 20 rivers, only about 2 or 3 of which you would recognize. Well, maybe you guys have recognized more than 2 or 3 because you've traveled in South America. But I doubt if even you had heard of many of these small rivers that we traveled on. Many of them tributaries of the tributaries of the tributaries.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to me as I was prepping for this and reading through and looking at the map in your book. And I think, I don't know what it is. I never would have really thought that you could do something like this on the rivers of South America, especially going up through Venezuela, getting into the Amazon, and going down. Just, I never would have thought about it, which is really cool. But yeah, what is it like? I mean, for you guys, that experience of how did you kind of plan out where you were going to go? Was it kind of just starting hey, we're going, into Venezuela up this river, or did you guys have in mind all the plans for the next kind of year or so from that moment where you did start traveling inland?
Well, I had read a book called Paddle to the Amazon by Don Starkel. And so I knew that if you go up the Orinoco, now this is unique to the Orinoco. This is the only place in the world where this happens. And it's a very little known fact. And that's that you can go up the Orinoco River almost to its headwaters, to where it's visibly not such a big river anymore. It's not tiny, but it's shrunken down to where it's only a medium-sized river. So this huge thing. So you're way up high, that is way far south in southern Venezuela, where the land is taller. You've claimed an elevation, and then part of that river splits off. See, the Amazon River, it flows from west to east. So people talk about the Amazon, they're talking about going, I guess, west and east on this big river. Well, this whole basin with all the tributaries flowing into it, or if you take the whole basin, it's almost more of a big circle, because there's all these big rivers flowing from the north southward into it, and big rivers flowing from the south northward into it. So we actually went across the Amazon basin against the grain, you might say. We went from north to south. We went southward on a tributary to the main stem. Then we went southward on a tributary, but upstream on another tributary. And then we did a portage. We're now on the Paraguay River, country of Paraguay, but we started in Brazil, then Paraguay, Argentina. And then we came out at the Rio de la Plata, which is technically a river, but it looks more like a Gulf of the ocean. If you look at a map of the world, it looks like a big Gulf of the ocean, but it's fresh water, so it's considered part of that river. And that was the end of our southward motion, because there's no further rivers going south. And there in Buenos Aires and Montevideo, that's where we did our turnaround. We came back by way of other rivers. And coming back, we followed the Uruguay, the Paraná, then some smaller rivers. And then we made a portage in Brazil to a major river called the Araguaia, which is connected to the Tocantins. And those two together, you might think of really just one river. But the Araguaia took us back into the Amazon again. So that's the river geography aspect of it.
Okay, yeah, very, very cool. And what's kind of, so when you're on, it's like a sailboat, rowboat, going up rivers, I imagine adds an interesting dynamic because you're either working with or against the flow of the river. But what's that kind of experience like? How do you navigate that?
Number one is that the oceans of the world are well charted for sailing and for navigational purposes. The rivers are not. Only in certain rivers of the world are they charted for navigational purposes, and that's where there's major shipping going up and down them, like the Mississippi River has complete charts. But these rivers in South America, they don't have charts. The location of the river more or less is known. You can see that on a satellite image or a map of the country, but there isn't much detail as to exactly how it bends and where the shoals are and everything. So, and where there's towns where you might be able to get provisions, because these are largely very remote parts of South America. You have to have some idea of the next town you'll be able to get some provisions in. So we did our mapping ourselves by going on to Google Earth and then using it as a platform upon which to create digital lines representing the shorelines of that river, and saving that information, not the digital photography, because we don't have the internet when we're out in the outback. All we have is those tracings. So those tracings became our maps, and we saw them in our handheld GPS. So we created our own maps through Google Earth through these tracings. And so that's the navigational aspect of it. As far as the boating, the boat management, the boat handling, there's by and large, rivers are easier than oceans because you don't have big waves, you don't have big storms. You have to overcome current. Going downstream is always very easy. Going upstream is more difficult. It's more tedious and slower. And if you come to water that's about the same speed as your boat, you pretty much come to a stop and you have to figure out how to get past that, or if you can. You're going upstream, you become reliant on a motor, and we did have a 2 horsepower Honda outboard. And later, when that broke down, we got this other device called, you might translate it as a little tail, but you should really call it a long tail because it has this long, straight, going straight back tail on it. And so it is a totally different kind of transportation, but by and large, it's actually easier and more pleasant than out in the oceans.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about. And, we don't have virtually any sailing experience, but I feel like one thing that has always made me feel a little bit anxious about the idea of sailing on, an ocean or big open water is just how big those waves can get. And, if you're so far from land, there's really not much you can do other than just sail through it. And obviously you get, rivers that are very intense and running really quickly. But yeah, I feel like you could maybe it would be like a little bit more manageable, I guess might be the word. Is that kind of what you would say as well?
Well, it's really described very well. I mentioned that book, Paddle to the Amazon, and I am in contact with, I'm a friend of this. That was a father and a son. And I'm a friend, the father's passed away, but I know the son, and I talk to him sometimes, and he says it very well. See, they were in just a canoe, and they followed a similar route in that they went all around the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea, and then they went up the rivers, and then they went over that divide and everything. And although in a way you'd think that the rivers were more challenging for them because they had to go upstream, and they had all these bad things happen. Well, he said, no, the saltwater portion was much more difficult because you're dealing with surf is the biggest thing. Here again, it's lee shores. The ocean waves are building up, until they're their biggest size, and then they're breaking onto the shore. And you don't ever want to get caught in that surf. So yeah, the rivers, you're just so glad to be in calm water again,
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. And so I'm curious, you guys had a baby along the way on your journey, right?
Right.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about, kind of how far along you were in your journey, when your wife got pregnant and just what what that was like?
Yeah, we found ourselves in the river systems, and although we were in a very remote part of the world, it was just jungle with, kind of a chaotic assemblage of trees that had fallen over into the water and vines hanging down and log jams partly obstructing the river, and hyacinths floating in the river. And, the shoreline is not necessarily anything you can step ashore very easily on because of all the vegetative chaos going on. Nonetheless, being in a boat, you don't have to worry about too much. You can just kind of live on your boat and occasionally go on shore if there's like a convenient place to do so. And we said, let's go ahead and have a baby. It's possible to have a baby and travel on these rivers. And so we conceived the baby there. And then after that, we continued into Bolivia, Paraguay, Argentina, Uruguay, and then we're coming back up into Brazil again. And I left it up pretty much up to my wife as to which country to have the baby in. And because all those would have been very acceptable. We met people in all of them that pretty much said something along the lines of, we can make sure that this will work out for you well. The cost to you will be little or nothing. And so have your baby in our country. And so the offers were all great. But Jenny preferred it to be Brazil due to her really good experiences in Brazil. And so we got ourselves to Foz do Iguaçu. You know where that is. That's a city of about 150,000 where Iguaçu Falls is. That's the city on the Brazilian side of the waterfall. And she researched ahead of time to find a little private hospital that we could afford. And we had a natural birth, which was unusual there. They mostly go cesarean in Brazil. And we got an apartment for the length of 1 month. So we stayed in that apartment for 2 weeks prior to the birth and 2 weeks after the birth. And then pretty much just continued on the voyage. We continued after that with our baby.
Wow. As people who have just recently had a baby this year, I can really know what that would feel like to, one, have a baby in another country. And then two, after a month postpartum with 1 month old going on travels. So good for you guys for doing that. Cause I'm sure it's a lot to just be traveling, full-time continuously on a sailboat, managing all of that. And then you add, a baby to the mix, and that's a whole other adventure. So really cool that you guys did that.
Yeah. A couple of aspects of that you might find interesting. One is that when a baby is born in a foreign country, it's immediately a citizen of that country, but you need to get a passport for that country. But then you want it to also have a passport for the United States. And that was the more difficult one to get, but we got that too. So there's all this paperwork. And then the other is that, so we're going traveling now with the baby on the river, on the boat, and we don't want to carry disposable diapers because where would we ever dispose of them? You don't want to have to store them up for like a week and then put them all in some garbage can a week later. And so we used old-fashioned cloth diapers, and we washed them in the river and dried them in the rigging. And so we always had the cloth diapers hanging along the boom and ropes running back and forth up above the boat. So it was just a constant. Every day there was having to dry all those diapers.
Yeah, I can imagine. And then one thing I'm curious about, so I know when you're traveling by a seaport, usually there's like customs and immigration people at every port. What's it like when you're crossing borders in a boat on rivers in South America?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's variable because there's kind of like two things that can happen. One is that the process will occur according to a sort of international set of rules that's really oriented towards large boats and shipping. And that is that when any ship or yacht comes from one country to another, it has a certain set of procedures. And it would typically be that in addition to whatever you need for the persons, that is passports and visas, you also have to have stuff for the boat, such as a crew list and papers showing that you own the boat and stuff like that. And then, however, when you're in these rivers, in some cases, they will be aware of that kind of procedures and try to follow it. In other cases, they're either unaware of it or they don't even try because they don't get enough people coming in, to ever brush up on how you're supposed to do the paperwork, So we'll be coming along, and in most cases, they don't know. And maybe they want to do as much paperwork as possible, but they don't even know how to do some of that paperwork. So sometimes that paperwork just doesn't happen.
Yeah, I could see that. I know too, like there's often having the immigration permits for the boat and stuff. So I can only imagine some of the bureaucracy you run into along the way, which kind of leads into my next question. I know just traveling in a more conventional sense through South America, you run into all sorts of crazy situations, let alone being on a boat on these rivers, probably places where they're not accustomed to seeing many travelers going, and then being on a boat in the Amazon and all that chaos that would entail. But what are some of the more kind of the memories that stick out for you in terms of things where you're like, well, this is really like kind of a crazy thing that's happening right now?
Well, wildlife is always best in rivers. I don't think there's any way to see more wildlife more closely than coming down, especially going down, because you're just floating with the current. So there'll be a dozen turtles all lined up on that log, and there'll be lots of these chinguillas, or what's the other name for a chinguilla? Capybara, the really big rodents. And they're just on the banks munching on vegetation. We saw a cougar swimming across the river. We saw giant anteaters, like 7 feet long, a couple of times. And just lots of, just all the wildlife, all the birds, all the crazy, many different kinds of birds that are, because the South America, not only is it really well connected by rivers, the river systems are largely the areas that are still less populated and less developed. They're still kind of just old-fashioned jungles. And so there's all the wildlife is there, and birds are really incredible. Roseate spoonbills and all these funny looking birds that you'd have to be a birder to recognize the name if they were mentioned.
Yeah, I know we took a trip to the close to the Amazon in Bolivia, I think they called it Las Pampas. And just the amounts of stuff you could see there. There was dolphins and snakes and sloths and birds and monkeys and
piranhas. Fireflies.
Yeah, it was crazy. Did you guys have any close calls with any animals? Any pumas trying to get on board, or big snakes, crocodiles, anything like that?
We never were endangered by animals, large animals. Not once were we ever feeling in danger of a large animal. There's little, kind of medium to small. So it is somewhat dangerous when you're wading in those rivers, which you often have to do when you're in a boat, because you're for various reasons, you're standing on the water, holding your boat, or walking a little ways with your boat, or having to pull your boat upstream and stuff like that. So wading, or just walking ashore, having left your boat anchored or something. And there's stingrays that are pretty dangerous. And I had a close call there. I didn't get stung, but I almost did. Of course, the biggest dangers by far are the dangers coming from stinging insects, mainly mosquitoes, and from bad water. And so we just had really tight discipline in those respects, and came out pretty good there. We never got any diseases from the insects. There's not just malaria, there's dengue and these other things. There's about 5 or 6 major diseases. And then we did probably get bad water a couple, 3 times, but by and large, we escaped that too.
Well, that's good. And then while you were doing this, did you run across many other people traveling in a similar way, or was it pretty unique and rare to run across another gringo on the river system down there?
Well, we did not see too many, and this was exemplified by the fact that we went up to Venezuela, the Orinoco, and then down into the Amazon, as I described. And then when we got quite far down to where the Amazon is, well, it's the Rio Negro, pretty big river, we saw the first and only yacht coming up the other way. And so they were the first sailboat or foreign boat that we had seen and the whole time, and we were the first foreign boat or sailboat that they had seen the whole time. So it was like we both entered South America from different directions, met in the middle, and we were both the first ones that we had seen the whole time. So no, not too many people doing it there.
Wow. Yeah, that would be really cool. Did you guys kind of just like flag each other down and stop and chat for a while?
Let's see. We were in this little town, and that was as far as they had come up. They had started at the mouth. They had sailed to the mouth of the Amazon. They had come up it, and they had gotten that far, and they had like that little town, and they had been there a few days, and we saw their boat, of course, and got together with them, and we remained friends with them, and still are friends, and they had kind of a base. They had made friends in Manaus. Where we met was further upstream from Manaus, but then we both got together again in Manaus, and we both were facilitated there in Manaus by these people that had a shipyard where we could keep our boat.
Okay, yeah, very cool. And then I know just from reading, on the way back, it wasn't all smooth sailing back to the States. Can you kind of talk us through that leg of the adventure and everything that happened?
Yeah, the river part of the trip came to an end in the city of Belém, which is at the mouth of the Amazon. This is when we got back to the Amazon, having come north by way of these other rivers. And Ginny and George had to fly back because the ocean would not be safe or doable with them aboard. And I had to solo it, single-handed. And it was difficult because the mouth of the Amazon was difficult navigationally. There was long distances. Like when a boat like what we're talking about, it is not designed for just going to sea and staying at sea and somehow sleeping through the night. No, there's no autopilot. There's no way to set the tiller to just go. You have to stop when you're not awake and managing the boat. And the distances were great, and there were navigational hazards for long periods of time. And so suffice to say that much there. And then coming out the mouth of the Amazon, you're on the coast of the Guyanas. That's the northeast coast of South America, with French Guyana, Suriname, and British Guyana. And they have their challenge too. The tidal fluctuation is 20 feet. That's a lot from high tide to low tide, and the shorelines are very shallow water, and then inland it's shallow height-wise of land. In other words, everything's flat, both inland and seaward, and so a 20-foot rise and fall means that the shoreline itself can migrate for miles, and you can be way out at sea and not even see land, and then realize that you're only in 3 inches of water and run aground because the muck is out there. And then conversely, if you come to shore, there's no real shore, because at high tide you get inundated too, and they're horribly inhospitable mangrove swamps is what they are. And so anyway, that's just an aspect of difficulty there. But that attempt to get to the United States, I made it about 2/3 of the way, and then upon reaching the Dominican Republic, I capsized in this really big surf that broke my mast, broke my sails, lost my rowing equipment. And so I gave it up at that point. I at that point I'd been 5 months away from Ginny and George, and I just sold the boat for a few $100s, what was left of it, and and took a flight home.
Wow, what an adventure, and what a way to kind of like end that adventure as well. Did you feel like at that point, like selling the boat, you were like, okay, I'm kind of done with sailing at this point, or I'm done with it for now, or how did you kind of like, I guess, feel at the end of that?
Yeah, it was hard to leave the boat. This was the capsize itself, sort of a shipwreck, was quite an eye opener. It was something that I knew could happen, and that eventually it might, just due to the repeated probabilities, would happen eventually. But I'm talking about a really big wave that was so big that the whole boat is just tumbling like in a washing machine, and me just tumbling with it underwater and everything. And then but then it was over, and here again, no lasting ill effects, except that the boat was could no longer proceed. And for me to make it right, I was in Dominican Republic. In the Dominican Republic, like in many of these countries, you really can't get stuff there that's like a mast. How do you get a mast there? You pretty much impossible. You'd have to just find a tree and whittle it down or something, and then there's so much corruption and import taxes and stuff. And so it was hard to leave the boat, because we had perfected that boat. Not only had we done those modifications initially that gave it tankage for water, and place to put your tools and your supplies, and the rowing station, and all these live aboard cruising features, like good mosquito nets around the hatchways and everything. But we had improved it over time, and well, we had to just abandon all that. That was a little bit hard to do.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I guess it's kind of like a natural disaster, like hitting your house, right? Like you guys had lived there for so long, and obviously having to give that up is pretty devastating. But I'm glad to hear that you are all right with that accident. And it seems like it was a really good idea to have Ginny and George, fly and whatnot.
Yeah,
So,
it was just a choice. To give up the boat, or give up your togetherness with your family. That's not. I had to get back together with my family too, so that had to take precedence.
yeah, 100%. I mean, 5 months is a long time to be away from your family, especially like small child and stuff like that. And so I'm curious, just kind of, overall with your trip, are there any kind of like, major highlights that kind of stand out of like, we saw this thing and it was really incredible. Like, what are some of those top experiences from your trip?
No one occasion is coming to mind. I would say it's here from this distance of it. It's the relationship I had with my wife, and how that all went, and how we have that always, to cherish and shaman in common now. So just many beautiful times and memories together of all the snorkeling and hiking, and scary times, like a passage or two where really scary, where I maybe was trying not to show my fear because I didn't want to scare her, but it was scary, and so, but I was proud of her courage. And in retrospect, moments like that have a certain stark beauty. You might have talking about where the waves are really big and you're really tired and you're not sure what's going to happen, stuff like that. Big rainstorms, during storms in the night, stuff like that.
Yeah. There's something about those shared experiences too that I think is one of the amazing parts of adventures like this, and travels in general, is the kind of having those memories of the relationships as well, which is really special. And then, so now I think this trip concluded in like 2014, 2015. Has there been any big adventures since then? What's kind of the next big adventure you want to take on?
Yeah, it's kind of back to weekend trips and stuff. Now it's just like, the another 18-year interlude between big trips. I don't know where that next big trip is going to be or when it's going to be. But I am preparing for one. I'm just sort of assuming another one will happen. And that's that I'm building a new sailboat of a different sort, longer, but no heavier. It's extremely lightweight type of multi-hull called a proa. They have the proas are something that you find in the Pacific Ocean. Certain island nations have this type of multi-hull called the proa, and that's what I'm building. But I'm about halfway done with it. I don't know when it's going to be done. I just sort of enjoy the construction process and the design process. And, but in fact, just today or tomorrow morning, going to start on a week-long hike. So I go on hikes and stuff.
Amazing. That's awesome. And you're in such a beautiful place in the world to have great access to nature, which is super, super awesome. And I know you've mentioned that you've got, 2 books about these trips. Can you tell us and listeners, about those books, what they're called, where they can go to find them, where they can go learn more about you, all that good stuff?
Sure. I have a website as an author, Stephen-Ladd.com, www.stephen-ladd.com. And I have on my website, it talks about the 2 books. 3 Years in a 12-Foot Boat is a thicker book. It's more personal and I would say emotionally intense, which to me, it really is. When you're by yourself, it's more emotionally intense. The 5-Year Voyage is similar in the way it simply describes a voyage, but it's kind of lighter in tone because I was in the context of my marriage, and we have a kind of easy, happy marriage, and so the tone is a little easier and a little bit happier. And but they both have lots of maps. The first book is more poetic. It has lots of poems, not very many pictures. The second book has a lot of pictures and no poems. So on my website, there's also other writings. I've written about other traveling experiences that I've been on, like that year that I traveled after high school in Europe, Asia, and Africa, vignettes from that experience and other writings I have there. So I encourage people to look those up. My books are available just wherever books are sold.
Awesome. Well, Stephen, thank you so much for your time today. It's been fascinating to hear about your adventures, and we'll definitely stay tuned for the next big one. But yeah, so cool to hear about your different experiences and really thinking about traveling South America in a completely different way. So we really appreciate your time.
I enjoyed spending the time with you guys. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you want more, make sure to check out The World Wanders Insider, available on Patreon at patreon.com/theworldwanderers.
For show notes, head over to theworldwanderers.com. Find us on social media at The World Wanderers Podcast and join the private Facebook community at World Wanderers, a community for travelers.
You can always get in touch with us at info@theworldwanderers.com. And if you enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. It really helps us find new listeners.
See you next time.